We we're supposed to begin a study in the book of Hebrews. I've always been very fond of this book. First commentary I ever wrote, Thomas Eves made me write it. It's 900 and something pages, I believe. 13-week course. Had to write the commentary, and I had to memorize this book in 13 weeks, besides classwork. I didn't like him as a teacher, but I learned to like him. It took a little while. Yes, it did. I learned how to memorize at least. First chapter probably took me a week at least. And by the time I got to the end of the book, I could memorize a chapter in about an hour and a half. It's funny how your brain works. Once you get used to it, it gets a lot easier. And then I didn't even have to say it in class. He just asked if I knew it, and I said, yeah. Oh, good. All right. I can't lie, can I? Boy, sometimes you want to lie, though, don't you? It's hard not to lie. Hebrews, I just got a brief introduction. There's so much about this book. It's argued about from the beginning to the end. I'm going to overlook a lot. I'm going to bypass a lot of that stuff. I don't think it's that beneficial to most of you. If you don't debate people or anything like that, it isn't going to matter. So we'll just skip it. The theme of this book is pretty easy. Everything is presented as better. That's what it's all about, better. You have a better hope in Christ. You have a better testament, better promise, sacrifice, substance, better country awaiting us, then of course a better resurrection. Everything is better. That's the whole point of this book. Is the Jews, they were persecuted pretty badly by other Jews, and these were in Palestine. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is my belief that it was the Jews in Palestine that the author wrote to. But it was because of the persecution, a lot of the Jews were sliding back into the law of Moses, trying to get along with everybody. Yeah, you think about how hard it was for these folks. You're a Christian family, and you believe that Jesus is Lord, but if you don't subscribe to the tenets of the law of Moses, you're going to lose your job most likely. You're not going to have a way to make a living. Or if you do make a living, you're going to go to the local grocery store, and he's not going to trade with you because you've been disfellowshipped by the Jewish community. Your children go to school, and other children are going to harass them and perhaps even physically hurt them. It was serious. No one had been killed so far, but they had been mistreated in a lot of different ways. The history of what went on, recorded by Josephus, was that it was a pretty violent situation. So what do? Your kids coming home from school and they're all beat up. You feel bad, man. You don't want your kids to be beaten up when they go to school, and you can't go to the grocery. You can't buy food. It's hard to find somebody that will sell you some food, and when they do, they'll charge you an arm and a leg for it. It's a terrible situation, and they just want the pressure to be released off of them. They didn't want to abandon Christ. That wasn't their intent. But at the same time, they wanted these Jews to leave them alone. because life was just too awful. So they started sliding back, started doing some things that they ought not have done in order to get along and not be harmed by these people. I can empathize with them greatly because the situation was absolutely horrible. But the author's letter is, don't do that. You're leaving the better for the lesser, and you don't want to do that. You may be hounded in this world, but in the world to come, everything is better. And he goes through, as we go through chapter after chapter, that's the argument he's going to make. Things are better. Christian Jews of Judea, Jerusalem are in danger of apostatizing from the faith because of the persecutions and trials heaped upon them by the Jews of that same area. This, of course, is my opinion. I'll show you why in a minute. But there's a lot of people that disagree with what I just said, a lot of biblical scholars. They're just wrong. I'm right. But you can judge for yourself. I'm not going to talk about their side. I'm just going to tell you what I think. A brief outline of the book. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 kind of sets it out. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. Who, the Son, being the brightness of his glory and the express image of God's person, upholding all things by the word of his power, or his powerful word. When he had by himself purged our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Jesus is exalted in these first three verses over everything else. He's superior to everyone and everything. He's superior to the angels. Now, the Jews, they had a high opinion of angels. They weren't supposed to, but they did. That was their custom at the time. They thought about the mighty angels and the power the mighty angels had. They knew they were superior to them, men, and they just, they deified some angels. They turned them into gods. And what the author's going to point out, let me just say this and get it out of the way. I think Paul wrote the book, okay? I can't prove it. I mean, I have studied for a very long time. I cannot prove that to save my life. But I believe that Paul is the author. So if I slip out and say Paul instead of the author like I'm supposed to do, please understand that that is only my opinion. Okay? That's just an opinion, and it's not worth a whole lot. Christ is superior to the angels that you people adore. Christ is superior to Moses, who everybody adored. Moses was the great lawgiver, and all the Jewish people looked to Moses as their leader in chief. He's superior to Joshua, who led the people into Canaan and gave them a rest from the toils of this world. He's superior to Aaron and his priesthood. That's the high priest. What he's teaching is that Jesus is a higher priest than the high priest of Israel was. Jesus' covenant is superior to the old covenant. The new covenant is greater than the old. And he'll prove all these as we go through the chapters. He proved that Christ's sacrifice is superior to the old sacrifices, Old Testament sacrifices, that is. Christ is superior, his faithful people, to all the faithless. The people in covenant with Christ, I don't want to say they're not superior spiritually, but they've been raised to a higher spiritual level, let's say, than anybody did under the old covenant. We know a lot more than Moses knew. Okay, no, Moses knew a great deal. We know more than he did, because in the New Testament things are revealed that wasn't revealed previously. Christ's testimony is superior to any other testimony. Everything about Jesus is superior to anything else. There's nothing can be compared to him. Since it is new, since it is better, it's obviously we don't need the old. Okay, leave it go, turn it loose, put it behind you, and move on to the new. Don't slide back into an apostasy. Hebrews, by whom was it written? I already told you what I think. Paul. There's a lot of opinions. Oh, man, I mean a lot of opinions. Some people got them out in the 2nd century A.D., having written this letter, but I believe it was Paul for a lot of reasons that'll bore you to death if I go through it. Who were the Hebrews? Now, that's a good question that deserves an answer. There's a lot of opinions, again. There's a lot of opinions about everything in this book. Who were the Hebrews? Some say Jews all over the map. It seems to me that the book of Hebrews would have been written to Palestinian Jews for several reasons, and we'll go through them, I think. Yeah. The word Hebrew occurs first in Genesis 14:13, and it means one who passes over. That is the river Euphrates. You remember Abraham came out of the land of the Chaldeans, and he was guided to the land of Canaan, where the Canaanites lived. And the people, they got this stranger in their midst. So who is this man? He's Hebrew. He's the one who's passed over from the Euphrates River. This was something that was not common in those days. People didn't move around the globe like they do now. But this was the way they would refer to Abraham, the Hebrew, the one who passed across the Euphrates and came to Canaan. Okay? That's all the word means. It's not a God-given name or anything like that. It's not a derogatory term. It's just explanatory to define who this guy is in our midst. In the Old Testament, the name Hebrew was used along with the name Israelite. We use them back and forth, back and forth. It denotes all the descendants of Jacob. This is pretty much the way it was used in the Old Testament, which deals primarily with the Israelites, let's say. But it was not the case in the New. In the New Testament, everything was different, much different than it was in the Old Testament. The Jewish world had turned upside down. Previously, the Jewish people lived in what was formerly called Canaan. Now it was Israel, and the 12 tribes of Israel occupied this territory. They lived in solitude. They limited all their interactions with other nations around them. Sometimes people would act up and do things they weren't supposed to. But for the most part, they stayed to themselves. They kept their bloodline pure. Well, over time, that changed. The Assyrians came and they took 10 northern tribes captive. And what did they do? They dispersed them throughout all of the Assyrian Empire. And man, they were everywhere, across the globe, you might say. And then later, the Jews, of course, God wanted to keep the Jews intact. He had to preserve the lineage of Christ. So he raised up the Babylonians to come and get the Jews, and they did. And they took them as a unit into Babylon. And they lived in Babylon as a community. And over a 20-year period, they all finally wound up going to Babylon. They were captives there for 70 years before they were allowed to go back to their homeland of Canaan. Well, when it come time to go back to their homeland, come to find out, most of them didn't want to leave Babylon. They had reasons for that. They were making a good living in Babylon. Some of them were bankers, some of them were lawyers, some of them owned the corner grocery store. Their kids were born there. Their kids were raised there. Their kids didn't want to go back to Palestine. You got to be kidding. Why do I want to go out and live out in the wilderness? Man, I'm living here where all the action's at. So they want to stay in Babylon, and they do. Well, some of them, of course, for business ventures, I would suppose, they would leave Babylon and go on to other cities, maybe on to Athens, maybe on to Corinth, and they would get involved in the stock market or something, and they would start making money, as they're wont to do. They're pretty good at it, really. My point is this: by the time of the New Testament, the Jews were everywhere. They were all over the map. Okay? So the situation, the cultural situation, is entirely different from the Old Testament. They're not similar. The Old Testament, you had a localized people. In the New Testament, you got Jews scattered everywhere, in every city. And a lot of times, they wielded a lot of power in those cities. They were very intelligent people. They usually knew how to make a lot of money, and they were given to do such things. So they became quite powerful in these various areas. What did the Romans think? Romans didn't care. They didn't care you're a Jew or you're this or you're that or you're the other thing. They weren't interested in such things. The only thing they were interested in was, making money and living large. And the Jews were up for the money part at least. I don't know how large they lived. A lot of them probably lived large. Prodigal son did for a while. Anyway, what you got to do when you get to the New Testament, you're going to have to think a little bit differently, because the cultural situation is very different from the Old Testament. I just said this, didn't I? When the Israelites migrated into foreign countries, there they learned to speak Greek. And this was the changing factor involved in their relationships. They learned to speak the Greek language. Well, back in Palestine, Judea, Jerusalem, the Jews who lived there, they still spoke Hebrew. Actually, they spoke Aramaic, a corrupted form of Hebrew, but instead of speaking Greek, they continued speaking what's called Hebrew. All these other countries, in order to survive, they gave up the Hebrew language, and they began speaking Greek. So you had two kinds of Jews, how they were identified. One group was a Greek-speaking Jew. The other group was a Hebrew-speaking Jew. And there was a difference. Believe me, there was a difference between those two groups. They did not like each other. The Hebrew-speaking Jews looked down on the Greek-speaking Jews. They seen them as being inferior. Now, there were a lot of Greek-speaking Jews who were of a pure bloodline still. Most of them weren't, but there were those who were. Nevertheless, they looked down on them anyway. They weren't going by bloodline anymore. They were going by language. And you'll notice some places in the New Testament where that distinction is made clear. Those who spoke Hebrew in Palestine, it's the only place they spoke Hebrew. Those who spoke Hebrew in Palestine were referred to as Hebrews. All the other Jews who spoke Greek, they were called Hellenists. They weren't called Hebrews. Now that's significant when you start trying to think who the letter was written to. The letter is obviously written to people of a Hebrew mindset, because the letter itself is Hebrew from one end to the other. The Greek-speaking Jews probably would have a very hard time understanding this particular letter, not the Hebrews. They would understand it very well. So there's a distinction, and it's important to note that. They were regarded as Jews, they were recognized as Jews, but they just weren't the higher echelon. That was the riffraff that lived in other places. The Hebrews were a notch above, at least in their own minds. They were a notch above. In the New Testament, the term Hebrews seems to reference the language as well as the rights and privileges of the seed of Abraham. So the major shift in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament, basically all of them are called Hebrew. The New Testament, that's not the case anymore. Remember, you got 400 years between when that Malachi laid down his pencil. You got 400 years until Matthew picks his up. So a lot of things happened during those 400 years. I mean, a lot of things happened. That's a good study in itself, the period between the Testaments. There was a lot that went on, a lot of changes in the world, a lot of changes in the Jewish culture. But we see it, bang, when we turn on the New Testament, because by that time it's full-blown change. In Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, we see where this distinction is made crystal clear in the book of Acts. In those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplying in Jerusalem, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists. See the distinction being made here? What was the problem? The Hebrews were in charge of distributing food to widows. And the Hellenists believed that their widows were being neglected because they were Hellenists and not Hebrews. And they were upset about it. And they wanted to make sure that their widows were taken care of also. Now, this is in the church. These are Christians. And they define themselves as Hebrews and Hellenists. This division existed even in the church. It continued to exist. So they got this big argument that arose between the two factions, and the apostles, you remember, appointed 7 men to take care of the business of waiting on table. They didn't have time, and apparently they was messing it up. So they appointed 7 men to do this particular job, and everybody calmed down. And it's interesting to note the 7 men they appointed were all Hellenists. The Hellenists were the ones that raised Arucus, and the Hebrew apostles were intelligent enough, in order to keep peace in the church, they selected 7 Hellenists, 7 Greek-speaking Jews, to oversee this particular work. And everything was fine. The Hellenists were happy, the Hebrews were happy, and the church was at peace. But this is one of the most glaring distinctions where you read about these two factions. The Hebrews, of course, were the Hebrew-speaking Jews, and the Hellenists were the Greek-speaking. In Philippians chapter 3 and verse 5, Paul wrote, talking about his credentials, he was circumcised the 8th day. He was of the stock of Israel. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. Now note, he is a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Concerning the law of Pharisee. What does that mean, a Hebrew of the Hebrews? It means he was born to Hebrew parents. His mother and his father were both Hebrew. They were pure Hebrew blood. There was no intermingling in his bloodline. Both of these people were I don't want to say caste, but it's kind of like a caste system unofficially. They would be very lofty in the eyes of the Jewish people because their bloodline was so pure. And he, of course, was the result of it. Delitzsch wrote, no traces are found of the existence of any such purely Jewish churches in the dispersion, where people were scattered all over the world, as the recipients of this epistle must have been. While the church at Jerusalem actually bore the title, the Church of the Hebrews. That's what they had plastered over their building. Ton Hebraion Ecclesia was posted on the building where they met, and which means the Church of the Hebrews. The people the churches in the other areas would not have been called the Church of the Hebrews. They wouldn't have done that because they weren't Hebrew. The only people that would have done that was the people in Jerusalem. Okay? So it's everything kind of points to this letter being written to Palestinian Jews. And the internal evidence is seen in the letter. I'm just going to name a few places. He tells them in chapter 10, verses 32 through 4, recall the former days in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. This was early on in the beginning of the church. Where was this activity taking place at? In Jerusalem, where the church was first born. After Stephen was murdered, the record states, there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. This is the only church I know of that was persecuted prior to the missionary journeys of Paul. They were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea, Samaria, except for the apostles. This is where the persecution was. And this is what the Hebrews author refers to. Remember what it was like back then and what you had to endure. Why? Well, you're having to endure it again. You got through it once, you will get through it again. The same church was persecuted by Herod Agrippa. Acts chapter 12, about that time, Herod the king, stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword, and cut off his head. And because he saw that this pleased the Jews, these were non-Christian Jews, of course, he proceeded further to seize Peter also, the ringleader. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. It would tickle the Jews to death to see Peter's head lopped off. But it wasn't to be, because God sent an angel who delivered Peter from what appeared to be his certain demise. Where was this at? In Jerusalem. We're all the way into Acts chapter 12. That's where the persecution was. Remember what it was like back in the beginning, what you had to go through. You're going through something different, but it's persecution nonetheless. Before the persecution of Nero in AD 64, the Roman emperors and magistrates of the empire were generally opposed to persecution. They didn't want anybody persecuting the Jews. And of course, Christians, a lot of Christians were Jews. You got examples of this in Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. There's two different examples in two different cities where the people wanted to rough up the Christians, and the magistrates wouldn't let them. No persecuting people here. When Nero accused Christians of burning down the city of Rome, there was a persecution that took place. I think it was only in Rome that this persecution existed. I don't know how far outside the city limits of Rome it went, but it seems to have been confined to that area because of what Nero had said about the Christians burning down the city. Some people say it would spread all over. I don't agree with that. That would come later in 93 AD when Domitian was Caesar. The first 3 years of his administration, Domitian was a pretty good ruler, but he went nuts. Most people think he had syphilis, and he went nuttier than a fruitcake. And all of a sudden, he started persecuting Christians. He was very opposite of what he was. And that was an international persecution of the Jews. So the persecution was rather restricted in the beginning to Judea And then there was this persecution that took place in Rome. There were isolated cases after Nero did what he did, but they weren't a major persecution against Jews or Christians, either one. These were all localized, and it usually had to do for money, because of money, more so than nationality. But the craftsmen in Athens, remember them? Our trade is in danger of becoming extinct because nobody's worshiping the goddess Diana anymore. We got to kill these dudes and get them out of here. That was the cause of the persecution, not because they were Christian, not because they were Jew, for that very reason. It was money. That's what sparked them to a revolution until the 90s. And then it was kill them because they're Christians. That's when it got real bad, seriously bad for the church. Therefore, the conclusion I got here, the letter was written to Hebrew Christians at Jerusalem approximately 62 A.D. I didn't say anything about the year. I just flung that in there on you. This is basically the most popular date that Bible scholars estimate for this letter. I see no reason to disagree. It's, I believe, very close to being accurate, plus or minus 5 years. Not plus, minus 5 years, maybe. But I'll go with 62. All these dates are educated guesses, you know. There's a few that aren't, but most of them are. Hebrews, therefore. Any questions over what I just talked about? Good. We don't want to get in a lengthy discussion of all that stuff. Gives me a headache. I was studying a couple of weeks ago and got a headache. And I thought, you know, when I teach this, I give people headaches. I get a headache when I study it. I'll give it to people when I teach it. So I thought, well, let's just give it. Okay, God has spoken to us through his Son, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Who is the Son? This is the all-important question. God, who at various times, well, we already read this. God, the eternal being, who has no beginning and he has no end. He's always been. It's hard to wrap your head around that, but it's even harder to believe that this isn't the case. I was happy when that finally dawned on me. If, let's say, God didn't have if God did have a beginning, the question would be, well, who created God? And we'd have to have a God who didn't have a beginning. Well, if that God had a beginning, our question was going to be, well, who created that God? Who created the next God, the next God, the next God? Sooner or later, you got to suck it up and accept the fact God had no beginning. It's illogical to think that God had a beginning. It goes outside the realm of logic. And if God had no beginning, God has no end. He's the eternal one. And it has to be that way. It can't be any other way. Because you can't explain God without his being an eternal one. You got to think about that a while. Chew it over and see how it goes. It took me a long time to come to grips with that. I had a hard time believing that God was eternal. No beginning, no end. That flew right over my head. He had to come from somewhere. Everything comes from somewhere. No, he didn't. And it's illogical to assume he did. Just think about it. He lives in the supernatural realm. We don't understand it. We've never been there. We have no idea what it's like. If God explained it to us, we wouldn't understand. Why? We've never been there. We have to compare things. That's why we always liken this unto that, to try to understand something. I can't explain what this actually is, but it's like this. God can't explain who he is, not to the satisfaction of us. So he explains himself by talking about his eyes, the mouth of God, or the hand of God, or the right arm of God, or the fact that God moves very swiftly. Maybe he has wings or something. All these are terms that are used not because God possesses these qualities, in order to help us understand something about God. Because we can't understand God. He's too big. He's way too big. There's nothing in our world that we can compare him to. And the same thing is true about the spiritual realm. I know the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are three eternal personalities. I know that. But that's all I know. Because it's all a mystery to me. My little brain can't comprehend it. So, what do we got? We got a universe that God created. Okay? In this universe, well, when God created the universe, before he created the world, God created angels sometime on day 1, 2, or 3. God created angels. He didn't tell us about it. He just did it. But we know he had to. Because everything God created was created in a 6-day period, which means the angels were created in a 6-day period. But on the 4th day, when God created the world, the angels shouted for joy. We know they were there on day 4. We know they were created in the 6-day period. So it had to be day 1, 2, or 3. I don't know which. But God created angels, much like him. These are spirit beings. They don't wear a body like we do. They're just spirit. And that places them above us in the pecking order. There would be God, there would be the angels, and then down here there is us, a notch below. Well, when all things were ready, when God had created everything he wanted to create, he then created the final item for his universe. Everything God created in the universe, every single thing, every planet God created, he created to provide an environment for man, the cream of his creation. And that's the only reason anything exists. Dogs exist for our benefit. All animals exist for our benefit. They're not equal to us. They're inferior to us. Everything in this world is inferior to us. Because God only created those things to prepare a good environment for man to live in. God created man, and man can enjoy all the fruits of the universe. But he can't extend beyond those fruits. And how badly everybody would like to see that. People have tried for years to reach God. Well, you can't reach God. Imagine this universe is like a fishbowl, and we're inside of it, and we just can't get out. We can't see outside this fishbowl. We live in the fishbowl. We can go as far as the end will take us, but no farther. You can't go where God is. That's his domain, not ours. So, the Lord, he wanted to communicate with man, whom he had created. He did that through angels. The record tells us if the word spoken through angels proves steadfast. That's the law of Moses. Moses received the law through angels. They were the medium that God used to transport his mind into the human mind. So God used angels to communicate his will. But man still wasn't redeemed. He was still lost in his sins. So God finally came into this universe himself, and he became a man. And as a man, he could die. He could make a sacrifice for the atonement of our sins and thereby set us free. And that was the only way it could be accomplished. Deity had to die and was willing to do so because he loves us. Isn't that weird? Well, we'll stop here. Lord willing, we'll continue next week. Look at that.